All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Today we're going to go through a webinar that we think is pretty important for people that are in the vulnerability space, vulnerability management space, and it's really how to take your vulnerability management program to the next level. And so, give me a second. So my name is James Adams. I'm a senior sales engineer here at Core Security, and I'll be acting as the moderator for today's webinar. And I have with me Bob Erdman, who is the Senior Manager of Product Management here for Core Security, as well as Randall Laudermilk, who is the Director of Business Development and Alliances at Carson. So thank you both for being here and sharing your knowledge regarding vulnerability management. We're going to go through just a quick agenda. Won't stay too long on this, but we're first going to start off with Randall talking a little bit about the state of vulnerability management today, what he's seeing as a vulnerability scanning and vulnerability management vendor, and some of the issues that some of the clients and some of the companies that they're dealing with or they deal with are facing. We're going to move into vulnerability management maturity model, which is really a phased approach that different companies can take based off of where they're at in their own vulnerability program. And then we'll talk about some of the next steps. So Randall, coming in from a perspective as someone that deals specifically with vulnerability teams, what are some of the common issues you hear from customers or prospects when it comes to vulnerability management?
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's, I guess it's the biggest word I can come up with if you look at the upper right corner of the slide is overwhelming. You kind of think about the context of things. I mean, as the slide depicts, we talk about thousands of servers and endpoints. Anytime you do an assessment in security, whether you're looking at logs or anything related to endpoints and network devices, just the hundreds of pages, literally thousands of pages of content you can get sometimes just trying to look at what you're facing. And then you add to that just the complexity of networks, not really a clear picture of how attackers can even exploit them. You think about today's environments with cloud and containers and IoT, OT, the list goes on and on. And, you look at the context of that, and when you're talking about vulnerability management, just think about the raw numbers, for example. Say like in the middle of this year, there was a statistic came out. We're at over 120,000 known vulnerabilities in over 4,000 different products. So contrary to a lot of popular belief, it's not just a Microsoft problem. This is a worldwide problem and a huge business problem. And you think about where we're going from here, it's not getting any better. A report a few months ago came out and said we might end up with over 20,000 new vulnerabilities discovered just this year. And so you think about what it takes to be a security practitioner in today's industry, just on vulnerability management, those numbers are just staggering. And as we all know, even at a steady state, COVID certainly didn't help us any. You think about, what we used to think about as our typical networks and managed devices and managed environments. And all of a sudden, within a week's time, everything turned on their ears and now everybody's working from home. How we do security, how we see security really became orders of magnitude more complex. So overwhelming is almost a kind word to say we're just swamped, and that's kind of where many people see what vulnerability management is today. So if we think about really where that puts us, those numbers are staggering just by themselves. But then you think about what you're supposed to do from an environmental standpoint. I mean, certainly. When's the last time somebody was told I have enough resources, everything's fine, I can do more with what I've got. Certainly, everybody here is do more with less. And when you think about just the cost of security, there's a lot of expertise, a lot of skill set, a lot of long hours that go into this industry and go into this business. And when you see things, in terms of 80 to 100 grand for a base salary for somebody that really knows their business. And if you look at places like New York, DC, San Francisco, Chicago, some other high-cost areas, you can double or triple those numbers. I mean, it really does get staggering in terms of just the environmental issues of what you have ahead of you and even just the initial cost investments. We look at, IT, business, system owners, we really do have to work together because as many people are starting to understand, this is no longer an IT problem. This is a business problem. So the stakeholder environment has certainly gotten more expanded as we've gone along. So we all have this desire to reduce risk. That's not anything new. And then when you look at things like mergers and acquisitions, teaming, third-party vendors, certainly as we all know, COVID. I mean, technology, people, network changes. It's the only thing that's constant is change. And as one person told me a couple of months ago, and you enter in compliance into the mix, certainly no one's getting a kitchen pass on compliance. It's expensive, it's non-negotiable. And even with COVID and people working from home and networks seemingly not being available and being closed, certainly how they have to respond to compliance has not gone away. And there's, like we said, it's expensive and it's non-negotiable. So with all that, you start to ask yourself a series of questions, where am I at in my vulnerability management program? We often hear, I've got antivirus and I've got a firewall, so we're probably pretty good. But then you really think about what it really means to be vulnerable. And so you ask yourself a set of questions. Say, for example, do I know what vulnerabilities really threaten my business? And if you're able to respond to that, say, yes, okay, you're at least getting a good start, and you're somewhat managing your terminology and at least your risk exposures to at least vulnerability. But often, when it comes to the environment you're dealing with, whether it's web or the network or cloud or mobile or containers or custom applications, even human weaknesses, rarely do we hear somebody that gives you a confident yes when you really ask them, do you really know what vulnerabilities threaten your business? And when you think about sort of the next stage of that, what about scanning and patching? Are you doing it for compliance purposes? Or are you doing it for regulatory purposes, internal policies, or because of a robust program? Is it systematic or is it more ad hoc? And so you start to think about what about now in terms of mobile? We talked about the environment's changing. You may have had a program 6 months ago, but do you really know, is that program effective as the environment has changed? But then you think about the term risk. Vulnerability and risk are interrelated, but they're not the same. In order to know what your true risk exposure is, you really have to look at what the threat is. Do you really? I used to use an example. My back door is open, but I live on top of a mountain in Montana, so I'm really vulnerable. What's the risk exposure? But at the same time, if that same back door is unlocked and you're back to a park and there's a lot of activity back there and some people have been breaking into houses, okay, well, I know what that threat is. So you really have to look at risk exposure in terms of a lot of different variables and not just a raw vulnerability or just a misconfiguration, for example. And, what do you know about the attack paths? Oftentimes somebody thinks about a vulnerability in terms of, a severity score. So I must not be all that vulnerable because that's a really low risk server. It's really not an important host in my environment. So is that really imposing a lot of risk? But there are a lot of attack vectors that happen, attack paths. Somebody can take something that seemingly is benign and attack it and then pivot across the network. So the attack path across your network is just as vital as the sort of a one or two dimensional view of I have a host that has a vulnerability. So when you look at these set of questions, if you really can't answer these questions with a firm yes, then there's a lot of work to do. And it's usually what we see as the most common, whether you're a Fortune 100 company or a small business, these same questions and these same environmental variables affect them all. And so when you look at this endless number of risks, critical assets, often limited resources, how do you improve your security posture? And do so with a systematic way, not just sort of the ad hoc or just kind of taking it as you go. At this point, I'd like to turn a discussion over to Bob to discuss what we'll call a threat and vulnerability management maturity model and how that particular model can help you frame a more effective means of developing and maintaining a risk-based approach with a real business context.
Thank you, Randall. A formal threat and vulnerability management program really is a critical component of a robust information security policy. It enables an organization to understand how adversaries are going to take action when they attack their environments, what vulnerabilities might exist within the organization, and how that combination puts critical assets at risk, and how you're going to manage and mitigate that risk to the business over time. So generally speaking, threat and vulnerability management combines understanding the organization's assets, information technology infrastructure, and systematic vulnerabilities as a coherent whole. Many organizations have complex networks. You may have thousands of endpoints, dozens of entry points into these networks, probably more than dozens these days, because with all of the remote workforce, every VPN at my basement or somebody else's house is an entry point now into the network. And when we get these vulnerability scan reports, they can be hundreds of pages long. And while they may, somebody may really understand their network operationally, organizations are challenged to understand the full breadth of the threats and threat vectors that they face on an ongoing basis. And without an understanding of how they will be attacked and exploited, they're unable to effectively counter the adversaries. We need to think like an attacker. So view your IT environment as your adversaries will. And the maturity model is a combination of asset analysis, vulnerability scanning, patch management and implementation, and then metrics that enable a step-by-step implementation program. So it's a significant departure from a lot of what we see in the current approaches, where very generally we'll see, implement a program, do some scanning, do a little measurement to make sure that we put the patches on. And it's not really that effective at blocking the attackers. And we see this time and again. Every week there's new breaches being announced in the news. Those are just the big ones. There's many, many more that aren't being announced in the news. And today's typical program is generally somewhere around the level 1 or 2 on the diagram in the maturity model, suffering from data overload and unable to effectively counter a dedicated adversary. And today we're going to walk through the process and give some insights into the model and tips we've learned along the way. And James, can you kind of start us out at the beginning and how we do this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so unfortunately, this is a part where many, or a phase, I should say, that several companies might be in, or maybe have started in, and then move to the next phase. But it could be that they've never scanned their environment for several reasons. Maybe they didn't think they were at risk. Maybe they never considered it. Maybe they think they're too small. But over time, they've started to realize that they need to start taking some proactive measure versus being reactive, which is that, hey, I just do Patch Tuesday for Microsoft. In other situations, it could be that they were relying on managed security service providers. So an MSSP was doing a lot of the patching and a lot of the scanning for them, and they decided, hey, we want to take this in-house. So where do we start? And the first way you start this really would be, acquiring a vulnerability assessment solution. So some type of scanner, whether it be network scanning or web application scanning, whichever one of those the risk is mainly at. And that will kind of get them on the path at least. And that's the purpose of this webinar in general, right? Is to find out where you're at within this model and see how you can, manage the state that you're currently in, as well as move to the next one. In this state, non-existent, it's, you're probably very reactive on what's taking place. So then we would move into something a little bit more focused on scanning. So we'll kind of move to the next piece of it, where these two work in conjunction. So what we find is that companies, they'll need to incorporate some type of strategy when they're going into this maturity model direction, right? You can't really do something without a strategy or a process. And vulnerability scanning from an offensive standpoint, right? If we think about defensive types of maneuvers and defense in depth, vulnerability scanning is more of that offensive way of identifying the threats on your assets before someone else does, someone malicious does. And so kind of moving in that direction with that in mind, you purchase a scanner, you start kicking off some scans. It's kind of an easy process, or at least it's an easy concept for security practitioners to wrap their heads around. It's something that, a company, whether they're in security or IT in general, can start kind of getting an idea of, well, what's the point of doing this? So having some type of direction when you're going through this, it gives you that focus, right? Puts you in that proactive state as you're working your way through, where do I go from this next place? And without a process, you end up not really having a strategy at all, right? So you end up kind of playing whack-a-mole with every vulnerability that pops up. You chase that vulnerability down, and that's when you start finding yourself overloaded, because you're not sure which one should be taking priority over the next one. And now your scan data, and I think Randall kind of talked about this at the beginning, doesn't mean as much to you because everything seems like it's something you should be doing, right? And you don't have the prioritization or the context for that business risk on that vulnerability. So as we kind of start moving through that, Randall, what are some of the common pain points that you find when you're working with some customers around vulnerability management and moving into that scanning phase?
Well, one of the things, we talked about was, first of all, just data overload. And, you brought up a good point with that. Oftentimes, when somebody goes kind of from that level zero sort of perspective, they say, well, I really don't need a scanner. Well, the first time they run a scan, they go, wow, I didn't know I had that. It's the ignorance is bliss sort of perspective was humorous, but also very applicable here because, the first pain point they get is, I just didn't know this existed, and it's a lot of information, but unfortunately, not a lot of context. We talked about threat alignment and prioritization, and where do I start? And so, we look at, whether it's policies or procedures or organizational context, those types of things really don't exist because they don't really have the program level perspective to treat this like a business program. At that level, it still feels like a technical task. And so when you look at too much data, not enough context, no real threat alignment, so really don't know how to validate the risk exposure the information they're getting. But one thing we heard not too long ago, a C-level officer told me that skill sets to interpret and respond to the data. Now, oftentimes, there's an assumption, well, okay, you're technical, you go do this. But doing the wrong thing wrong, or the right thing wrong was a phrase that I heard, and it sort of sets the real stage for where you're doing the best you can do, but without that context and without that business savvy and that program policy procedures perspective, you can really try to do your best at this level, but without that without an overall program perspective, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes and really not get the effectiveness you need to. So whether it's dealing with compliance and frameworks, which, I love frameworks, it gives you consistency and a strategy because they're typically developed off industry best practices. And so it gives you a really good place to start and how to frame that program. But yeah, pain level, too much data, not enough context, and certainly not enough overall strategy to do it effectively.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Bob, we're moving from scanning, like Randall mentioned, and a lot of good points, especially around, doing the right thing the wrong way, right? So training, skill set, all those things come into it. If you just have the technology, but you don't have the people and the processes, they all need to kind of work in conjunction. So when someone's moving from just scanning for the first time, what are some areas that they should be looking at when they're creating a new scanning strategy?
James, moving into assessment and compliance can oftentimes be considered the most difficult adjustment for companies to make. You have vulnerability scan reports coming in, probably from multiple vendors to cover different attack vectors. And how do you sift through all that data and then prioritize? What vulnerabilities impact critical business assets and have the particular combination of characteristics that make them the most dangerous or risky to our business? And insufficient prioritization capabilities can leave really dangerous things hidden in plain sight. It's not just sufficient to say we're going to patch any vulnerability with a score above 8.0, for example. Vulnerabilities with high scores may not really be the most risky things in our environment. And if I can exploit a lower priority vulnerability and gain a foothold into the environment and then escalate my credentials and pivot, shouldn't that take precedence over something with a high score that an attacker is really unlikely to compromise? Getting back to that thinking like an attacker is going to think, what am I going to do to actually compromise you? And I don't care what the score on the vulnerability is, I care what access I can get. And at level 2, many times we'll see the process for scanning and assessing vulnerabilities, structured around relevant compliance regulations to kind of assist with understanding relevance and priority. Regulations like PCI DSS explicitly state that organizations have to run network scans at least quarterly or whenever significant changes occur in the network. And it's kind of up to them to decide what a significant change is. And these same styles can be true also for patching, requiring patches within 1 month of a patch release. And many recent PCI-related breaches were caused by failure to patch systems and applications for several months. And we see that all the time. People don't necessarily apply patches. They can't keep up with the volume of patches. Maybe they patch the vuln and they forget to restart the server to make the patch effective. Configurations are leaving open holes. So there's lots of different ways that you may have an attack vector into your environment. And patching in a more timely fashion, as the regulations require, would certainly limit the scope of breach damages in many of these cases. And it translates then to less risk exposure for the business. And preferably we're implementing measurable vulnerability assessments and patching processes that are risk-based rather than just purely compliance-driven. Metrics are now focused on security improvement. Penetration testing is being used to validate the vulnerability paths, the patching activities, and that's going to let you prioritize and confirm your remediations that you've taken are actually being effective. And Randall, maybe you can take us through an example of what one of these assessment processes would look like.
Yes, we got an example up here, and going back to your point about business risk and compliance, and measuring, having tangible metrics, and even during your assessment and your prioritization. One example I can give, before we get into this particular illustration is, you think about maybe for compliance, payment card industry says a denial of service doesn't fail the compliance metric. And so they may be true because what they're focused on for that particular compliance measure is protecting cardholder data. So a denial of service, against the network, maybe that doesn't, expose cardholder data. But if you're a network administrator trying to run, a business operation and keeping business operations moving slowly operationally, or move smoothly operationally, denial of service is a big deal. So there's a huge context there when you think about business context and compliance. Oftentimes, as we all heard the catchphrase, compliance doesn't always mean secure, but they do work together. And then oftentimes there is a lot of a correlation there between what is the source of the problem and what do I want to do with it from a risk context. An example here, we talked earlier about data overload. This screenshot on the left is just an illustration that, I've done a scan of a small network. And trust me, small network. I've got, and at face value, I've got almost 2,000 findings, but there's no context there. An IP address, what does that mean? What business context does that have? I've got an operating system and a short description of the vulnerability, whether it's a password issue or issue with a virtual machine or something. But all I've really got at this stage is a mathematical algorithm that says 6.5 for your score. Not much context there. And so at raw data, yes, I do have overload and I don't have any context. So if we talked about the maturity model moving beyond sort of that level 0 and 1, I can't prioritize based on just raw data with no context. So what this example on the right illustrates is, what if I could take that same information and even in the two-dimensional perspective, start to looking at not just an IP address, but that's a highly critical asset related to the sales function. And it will pass, and it will fail PCI. And I've got a severity score there to help me guide some context in terms of severity just for that asset. And so that much in the context, now I'm looking at that machine not based on a technical perspective, but an operational perspective. And certainly for payment card industry, for that compliance measure, I've got a metric that tells me whether I'm in alignment with that or something I should address just for compliance sake. But then if we go farther, and this is where Core and Sync have been working together for years, and where we really see the value of a lot of the interoperability and really the value of having tools working together is, say, for example, here, if I look at these 3 findings, I know I've got some real problems with a couple of assets that are related to my PR function and my sales function. But not only is it going to fail PCI, Core has found through their research that it's exploitable and there's real risk exposure. There's a real threat for 2 of these findings. So if I look at this, out of 2,000 findings, just focusing on the severity in a business context, I'm down to 98 findings. And now I want to focus on the threat alignment, even at a two-dimensional perspective, without testing and validating. I found that I can focus on these top 2. And so I've gone from 2,000 findings down to 2 for today's focus. So you're really looking at prioritization in a different perspective. Now, if you take just a brief example at the bottom, okay, well, now what do I do about it? My response has got to be somehow tied to that business context. I take that same information, and now I've got something raised related to the customer database. It's a highly critical asset, and I've got the host information and where to focus my time and attention with patching. And in this case, it addresses a couple of other issues that we often see. As James talked about earlier, sometimes you don't know what you have without moving beyond level 0 and level 1 in this kind of a step-by-step process. In this perspective, they've still got a Windows XP machine out there supporting a business function. They didn't know that until they got into the scanning because that asset was never managed appropriately and it just got lost. And so there's a lot of information that you can glean by starting that program and looking at things more from a business context and a perspective that you typically may not do if you're just looking at it specifically as a technical challenge.
Yep, no, good point. I can tell you that's a penetration tester's dream right there, is to have vulnerable systems that are outdated operating systems as well. So then the next phase of this is we've got scanning in place. We're basing that scanning off of some type of framework or compliance related regulation, and that gives us at least an idea from a company perspective why we're scanning and what we're scanning for. But you brought up a lot of good points around the overload and putting in the context. So as we move further down the model, we're going to start moving not so much away from the compliance piece, but a little bit further from that, right? And you mentioned it, a phrase earlier. I've always heard a phrase differently at a different company, which was, the byproduct of having a good security program is you become compliant, right? So, hey, we're doing all these best practices, and now we're compliant. Sure, you'll have to kind of make sure that the framework and you're hitting all the different metrics for that. But now that you have this structure in place, you can start moving further up the maturity scale. And this is when you start validating those vulnerabilities. You start penetration testing against those findings, right? We've got false positives, true positives. We want to make sure that these are exploitable. They're not just vulnerabilities that are existing out there and then we're patching, but what would be the true risk if these were exploited? And, we have teams that we talk to a lot that are really, working around, hey, we want to validate that these vulnerabilities are exploitable. We want to be able to hand off these findings to our patch team to show, to prove, because sometimes we get some pushback from them. So the validation piece really starts to improve the overall security posture of the company, if you think about it that way. And so not only is your scanning program becoming more mature, but your entire security program is starting to become more mature, right? Because you're taking the next leap of that. Randy, what are some of the areas that you've noticed companies are dealing with when they go from the vulnerability, scanning phase, compliance phase? We talked a lot about the risk and the context. Tell us a little bit about the prioritization of vulnerability management.
Well, one of the things that we see is really, if you think about sort of a top-down perspective, is collaboration between system owners, IT, security, other stakeholders. From a programmatic standpoint, it's, as we said earlier, the phrase that this is a business problem, not an IT problem. And just having the same language and being able to speak together in the same terminologies and business perspective and things like that. So even just trying to go to that level of collaboration in terms of prioritization, having the IT folks, the cybersecurity folks think about things in the business context to help drive that prioritization is often a challenge. Next is just identifying what assets they really have. We talk about, vulnerability scanning and penetration testing and red teaming and those type of mechanisms to building the prioritization. But oftentimes what that really means is they really don't know what assets they really have until they get into these things. So coming up with tangible metrics is another one. You mentioned it here in terms of focusing on metrics, improving security. Certainly compliance, as you said, continuous security a lot of times equates to continuous compliance. Compliance and frameworks often give you metrics to work off of, which is a good thing, whether it's security controls and things like that. But one of the biggest challenges they also face is now when somebody says, well, give me my risk score. And that's not a technical answer. I can't tell a business owner are you risk averse? What's your risk posture? You have to build that from a business perspective. So I think they find often moving to this level of maturity, it's much as a difficulty at a program level in identifying these metrics as it is a technical problem. But, it's just not operational policies, when to scan, who to assign the work to. It's also just getting getting that mechanism in place where they really are working together is often the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? It always has to have some kind of business context, not just the technical context of the scan, right? What is the business risk and how does that play into the strategy overall? That's a good point. Okay, so this is the phase I think is really interesting, right? Because at this point, we're really, it was great to have the compliance piece of it, but now we're moving way up into the scale where, you're starting to test, and like you mentioned, we're aligning that business risk with security goals. So what's the business risk? What are we trying to solve here? Have we identified those risks? And then does that line up with our own security goals? And we're approaching this from an offensive perspective. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people will focus on firewalls and SIMs and AV, and that totally makes sense for the defense in depth strategy. But from an offensive perspective, now you're getting into, scanning, vulnerability management, patching, technical testing against your scan results, and you've moved further up to where you've implemented a program of continuous testing, which if you think about continuous testing, you're ultimately shrinking your attack surface from a vulnerability and penetration testing perspective, which makes it easier for some of your defensive tools that you have in place or defensive security team members, because now you've made those tools not have to focus as hard because the vulnerabilities are being tested against. Bob, what are some areas that you see based off of what we've got on the slide here and some stuff working with teams that are kind of coordinating these two things together?
James, when we're in the attack management stage, our program is really starting to look at vulnerabilities and patching as a complete closed loop ecosystem rather than separate functions. We need to build policies around formal processes for vulnerability management as a whole now. And it's no longer just simply scanning and patching methodology. We want to be more advanced and have a thorough process considering penetration testing as well, used for vulnerability validation and to uncover any other attack paths that may exist in these environments. So, scanning and analyzing and then patching and validating gives us a risk-based approach to our patching processes, and it's going to augment just our simply compliance-driven patching methodologies. And that approach is going to help us to isolate and associate those high-risk business assets, PCI databases, PHI data, critical SCADA or ICS control systems, and everything will now become part of our overall threat and vulnerability management program. And that's ultimately going to result in a better way of managing, that overload of data that we talked about earlier. We need both information security and IT operations to have and adopt tools and processes that add value to the data that we've received from the scanning and the pen testing, so we can consolidate all these sources and employ a more advanced level of prioritization. That's going to help us with that data overload. It's going to let us, really look at the critical things first, the most risky to our business, and help us reduce, the amount of time and process that we have to deal with. And it's going to get us have metrics that are truly focused on improving our security versus maybe just busy metrics that I applied, 4,000 patches last month. Were they the right 4,000? I don't know, but I applied 4,000, which was a lot. Isn't that cool? So prior to that, organizations or maybe just a company to identifying the numbers of how many vulnerabilities did I see, how many things did I patch, what's my overhaul coming into the next cycle when I'm going to have more things to do. And as we look at the endpoints and network devices and applications and all the other systems, just having those busy metrics is not really good actionable information as we bring this up to upper management, to our risk and compliance officers, and show, are we increasing or reducing the risk to our business over time? And really processes move us from these point in time to more of continuous metrics. We want to show trends. We want to focus patching on risky critical assets. We want to introduce additional threat vectors and maybe even start to introduce red teaming concepts for, formal pen testing, spanning information security and IT operations together. Again, we want to really become an attacker and think very threat-centric about our environment.
Yeah, so Bob, so we've got different ways we talked about thinking like an attacker and taking advantage of the vulnerabilities that might exist in these different parts of the network, whether it be your web server or your database that's hosting information for that application that's public facing. We've got some ideas here on how we could show an attacker moving through the network. Can you walk us through a little bit of how somebody could take advantage of these different vulnerabilities that are spread out without having any of that business context, right? You're patching something that you don't think is, hey, like you mentioned, 4,000 patches, so what? What about the ones that an attacker can actually take advantage of? And how can you put that context into it by using penetration testing and scanning together?
Yeah, when we are, thinking like an attacker, we're going to be identifying likely attack paths to the crown jewels of our business. And hopefully we have undertaken an effort to identify really what are our most valuable assets and data, or our crown jewels. It may be diagrams and intellectual property designs. Maybe it's our customer lists. Maybe it's cardholder data if you're a PCI type shop, or it's healthcare information if you're a medical focused. And that lets us know, what is most important for us to protect. If we are attacked, what are they going to target, and how might they reach those systems and data that would be of most value to them? So many times they may target, externally facing systems with web applications that maybe have flaws that have been introduced to them. We can attack with, a SQL injection, get access into a front-side web server, and then pivot into a database, and then use that database to scrape credentials, and then pivot again and keep getting deeper into the enterprise while we live off the land. So there's many different ways that can happen when people come in, and it's not just that I've got things way back in the back room, but how many ways do I have to access that? And we see that happen all the time. Sometimes it's unintentional, sometimes it's the way things were designed. Well, I stood up this test server and I'm going to run my test, and then I accidentally plugged the wrong switch port into it, and it has access to the internet that I didn't plan for. Or I stood something up to test a new version of some application code, and I forgot to unpublish it for the weekend, and now it's up and publicly facing, and people are continually scanning and looking for these vulnerabilities. So as we start to think more about how an attacker is going to get a path from some way that they're going to try and get access to us, so from the outside as a malicious insider, as a partner type file drop, whatever that case might be, and we start to walk our way through our organization of what are all the different methods that somebody might use to get to my critical data. And those different entry points are points we want to focus on, and how that attack path might get us from point A to point B, where now someone is exfiltrating my database and telling me to pay them money, or they're going to post it up on the web. So James, can you kind of take us, or you might have some comments on this as well from your experience.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the pivoting piece can be very integral to how a penetration tester goes from one part of the network to the next. But when we were talking earlier about context and risk of that asset and of that vulnerability scan data, maybe this is how you start prioritizing it, right? Randall did a great job of talking about all the different scores that come on these assets. But when you start prioritizing them based off of, hey, wait a second, these are a bunch of low-level scores of vulnerabilities on these machines, but these machines are in some really critical areas. And are we mapping out, a way that a threat actor might take advantage of those? And let's maybe patch those first versus just patching based off of, hey, I've sorted them by, most risky to least risky based off of their scoring mechanism. So this is kind of how you could look at it from an attacking standpoint. And it really goes into that continuous testing, having a process, formalized penetration testing internally, working with your vulnerability management team. And essentially we move into the next phase really, which is your business risk management. So now you've got this very robust, mature organization for vulnerability testing, penetration testing, possibly even moving into that red teaming engagement, where you're shrinking that attack surface because of the constant back and forth, either your blue team's monitoring stuff, your red team's attacking, your vulnerability teams handing off that data, you're running these different campaigns. When we talk to companies that get into this phase, really, it's much different than when we're talking to companies that are in the earlier phases, because in the earlier phases, scanning and compliance, sometimes they're asking the vendor. Companies will say, hey, what are other people doing, or how do, what are we things about this? So we might offer advice, so they might be asking us. When we get into this phase with companies, they've got their process. So it's almost, how do we augment that? Like they will come to a company like Core Security or to Carson Saint and say, help us augment some of the stuff that we're doing. How can we enhance that? Do you have a toolkit, or do you have a set of tools or solutions, I should say, that can help us get to the next level? Because we have a process in place, and it's pretty fine-tuned. Any suggestions or any takeaways from experience talking to customers that get to this level? And this could be for Bob or Randall, either one.
Well, this is Randy. One of the first things that we see was oftentimes there's not much correlation between the size of an organization and where they reach the maturity model. And sometimes there's an assumption that a Fortune 100 company certainly has the resources to be able to get to this level, but a lot of times their problems are at a larger scale, and it requires a lot more effort to do this. But one of the things we've often heard is, they, by doing this, they really see demonstrated tangible results. First, some of the challenges that we talked about earlier: greater control over the resources, higher confidence that what they're doing really matters to the business, and they're spending higher quality time on the threat-based risk exposure, but also this concept of continuous monitoring, continuous compliance, and red teaming gives them greater confidence that they're in sync with the business operations. Businesses are very dynamic, and change happens every day. So by using this type of mature approach, they really are in sync with how the business operates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, James, we also see people that have, these things in place, being able to spend more time reducing risk versus the tedious type work. So for example, if I have my scanning in place and I'm inserting some tools to go out and validate those remediation steps, make sure they're effective, not only am I able to verify that I've reduced the risk to the issues that were discovered and uncovered, I've taken care of them, I've remediated them, I've proved the remediations are effective, and I can hand that off to my management teams. But I can do that much more quickly because I can use the tools to do that work, the tools that can continually take that scan feed, turn around and test against it. Now my remediation step is complete, and I'm going to just retest again and just make sure that everything I did actually was effective. And as I can reduce the time spent in those steps, it allows me to spend more time on the protection and remediation and patching steps that are really important and the underneath part of all of this. When you're being shown where these issues are, you have to actually fix them. And the less time that we can spend discovering the issues and testing the issues and validating the issues, the more time we can spend actually fixing them.
Yep, no, that's a good point. And I think it's a really good point about, the size of the company. I know I've spoken to companies before that were very big, right? 5,000, 6,000 employees. I mean, they're not, enterprise level, but mid-enterprise, and they didn't have very much in place at all. And then I've spoken to companies that are 200, 300 employees, and they had a very sophisticated security plan in place, right? So really, judging people based off, or judging companies, I should say, based off of the size, you really have to ask the right questions and really understand where they're at in their own maturity phase, right? What approach are they taking? And so when we talk a little bit about the products that we both offer as security vendors that play in this space, Core Security has been in the vulnerability penetration testing, penetration testing software space for over 20 years, and our product Core Impact gives companies a way to, at almost every phase, maybe not the non-existent one, but almost every phase, the ability to start validating vulnerabilities or start taking that scan data and applying it for compliance reasons. Hey, I've got PCI, I've got FISMA, I've got different banking compliance regulations that I've got to adhere to. So I need to do some reporting. I need to do continuous testing based off of that and prepare for that. And our product really works well with other technologies like Carson Saint from a scanning perspective, because now they can take that scan data and they can start applying very safe to use exploits against those systems to start saying, was it a false positive? Was it a true positive? Am I patching the right systems? Are these really vulnerable? Are they really exploitable? And we try to give it to them in a very easy to use framework, so you don't have to be a 10-year red teamer or OSCP certified penetration tester to at least be able to identify which vulnerabilities are exploitable, and start kind of working your way through that model utilizing some of the technology. The skill set still means that you need to still have a certain level of skill, an understanding of the risk, but why not make the software to be able to do that a little bit easier for people so they can move up the scale themselves? And there are some ways that our two companies can benefit from each other. I think we've kind of alluded to that before. So I'll start with Randall. What are some ways that Core Security and Carson Saint can really kind of utilize the two technologies to help companies as they move through these phases?
Well, from our perspective, and immediately for us, the time to, the reduced time to value. By having this relationship, like you said earlier, Core's been around this business, since the 90s, and Saint equally so. We've grown up in this industry, and so we've seen how it matured, and our products and solution offerings have matured as well. And so being able to have that, the interoperability between the two solutions certainly gives our immediate customers value. But for us, in terms of an organization, being able to team with a trusted partner that has that same background and that same lineage, it gives us the power to move forward and look at other solutions and what we really can bring to the market with the combined strengths that we bring to bear. So I look forward to really working with the Help Systems family and the Core team as a partner as we bring new solutions to the market.
James, having a flexible and powerful scanning partner in Carson Saint allows our customers to really efficiently build that closed loop scan, prioritize, patch, and validate process. And it's extremely important that we're not focused just on Windows and Linux type operating systems. There's SCADA, there's IoT, there's web applications, there's databases. Really anything and everything in our environment needs to be evaluated, and if found to be deficient, needs to be remediated. And we can quickly take the results of a vulnerability scan and improve exploitability and risk based upon what was found inside of that scan using the impact penetration testing tools. And then once patching or remediation steps have occurred, we simply hit the replay button, and Impact will go out and retest everything and produce a report to management showing what's been done to resolve the risk to the business, and if anything still needs to be dealt with that actually wasn't fixed by the last remediation process. And James, I think we've kind of reached our last slide here from the session, so yeah, maybe we should open it up and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Yeah, definitely. We'll take a look at see if we have any questions. Let me open this over here. All right, we've got one question, and it actually talks to the point that you just made around IoT devices. I know that I hear a lot about ICS or SCADA systems. So the question came in. I have. If I have Linux and Windows to protect, what about any recommendations for OT, SCADA, IoT, and cloud environments? I know I get those a lot, Bob. Do you have any thoughts on how we would be able to address that, or even, Randall, if you guys address any of that?
Sure, and there's a few different ways that we approach some of those environments. Many times these SCADA, ICS type systems are they're pretty critical infrastructure, and they don't always have backup / test type environments where you can go. So you have to be really careful as you're pen testing these things to make sure that we don't risk bringing something down or offline. And usually we'll actually start more on the enterprise side, for lack of a better word, even though we know a lot of these aren't really enterprises. They could be fairly small, maybe a rural water district or something like that. First off, what is around that system? There's Windows machines controlling it most likely. There may be Linux systems controlling it. We look at, can we compromise a system that has access to the SCADA systems then? So if we can compromise a Windows PC, maybe scrape credentials that allow us to make changes to that SCADA environment's operations, That's the kind of thing that's going to happen as people attempt to attack these systems. We generally would want to start from the inside. We're going to run, standard vulnerability scanning and pen testing pieces around exploiting those interconnected system, the parts of the whole. And then we probably also want to be looking at it more from an outside, more of a black box style. If I send phishing credentials or a phishing email, can I get credentials from one of the employees? Can I penetrate through a remote access or VPN type system? As these environments are building their plans during COVID, many of them have enabled external access for monitoring and management. Can I target that external access, pivot from there to an internal system where I can now affect those SCADA controls or those IoT controls? And as we look down to the lower level devices, then, do I have exploitable issues inside of my systems? So is there an issue in the security camera that we're using that allows an attacker to get a foothold in there and then pivot through the network, or in my external gate card reader system, or possibly my industrial control environment? And we've seen different attacks on these different things recently. There's been a lot actually of water system type attacks in the news, and electric power grid type attacks in the news. So we really want to look at it holistically. It's not just the IoT device or the SCADA control. It's all the things that are connected to that'll give me as an attacker access to actually do the damage and the alterations to those systems. Randall, do you have any other comments around that?
Actually, you brought up an interesting point when we talk about health systems and we talk about things like IoT or cameras and things connected to Wi-Fi. I'll give you an example. One of the exposures that we see, particularly when you think about operational technologies. A lot of these technologies were built even before the internet existed. I mean, you kind of think about the age of that. They were single point devices, and they were never really designed to do things over the internet or over Wi-Fi. But over the years, vendors keeping up with technologies and approaches add those type of things like a wireless radio to a healthcare device, because they want that device connected to Wi-Fi so that patient information can be fed into the patient database. The doctors can see efficiencies. The people on the floor see the efficiencies, so they can access content for the patients and monitor that remotely versus going room to room to room. Well, on the surface, that seems like a very viable operation. An assessor, an attacker knows, well, I can go set in the waiting room, connect to the Wi-Fi, and if I can exploit that Wi-Fi, then I can get information, the clear text data that's being passed by these operational devices, and they've got access to patient data. So there are that cascading effect. So on the surface, somebody says there's not a known vulnerability to that MRI machine or that that drug pump. The impacts of OT and IoT and things like that being connected to traditional IT really starts to introduce risk exposures that they really can't comprehend, but attackers know very well.
Yep, that's a great point. Let's see. Another question we have is, do you recommend organizations conducting penetration testing in-house, or is there any benefit to bringing in a third party to test? Yeah, I mean, we offer both here at Core Security. And I think it's a great combination to have both of those. Obviously, from a compliance standpoint, you might be mandated to have a penetration test either annually or biannually, and you might be mandated to have scanning. So we've talked about PCI. I know there's banking regulations, whether it be FFIEC. Different regulations will say you need to have scanning, or you need to have some type of third-party test come in. However, that doesn't mean that you can't do it throughout the year, right? So why, that's a third-party test is going to be a snapshot in time. They're going to hand you your findings, but you're still going to have new applications, new vulnerabilities that exist that we've talked about, new configuration changes. All of these things are going to be happening until your next third-party scan or test comes around. So being able to continuously validate and find those weaknesses yourself, not only will it, make you more secure throughout the year, but it also might reduce the cost of that third-party test, since they won't have as many findings, right? They'll be going through there not exploiting as much, so it could help them out a little bit, help you out, as well as it'll give you the ability to understand where your weak points are and how to shore those up throughout the year. So I think having a combination of both of those is a really good strategy for companies to take. Okay, we got one more question, and I don't think we have anything else. So, what do you commonly see as a high priority issues when organizations start to pair vulnerability scanning and penetration testing? And I'll kick that over to you, Randy, if you don't mind.
Please say again.
Yeah, sure. It's, yeah, what are some of the high priority issues that an organization will pair, you know, when they put together vulnerability scanning, they're putting together penetration testing? What are some of the high priority issues that they're looking at? Are they looking at, you know, the CVS score, CVE score, I should say? Like, what are some of the pairings of those two technologies? What are some issues that customers have?
I think in some cases, when they look at taking beyond an assessment and they go into validation, certainly some of the issues are, is it a critical asset? Do I really have authorization to go beyond just the scanning, just the assessment and the analysis? You know, if it's a critical web server, for example, that's, you know, like if it's, let's just say, for example, it's, you know, Reagan National Airport and you're looking at their point of sale devices. Some of the first issues is how far can I take a penetration test? Operational technologies, these, I guess we said earlier, these things are very fragile. They're single point devices. Many times they're old. Even running a vulnerability assessment can be somewhat risky. And if you're paid to keep the lights on in your power company, the last thing you want is a security technology to bring a device down. So they really do have to start with the very fundamentals of how much of this can I institute or implement based on, you know, what we're seeing. But in terms of penetration testing versus vulnerabilities, also just that closed loop. You know, I want to make sure that these aren't independent functions. You know, the scanning team does one thing and then we outsource a pen test. They really do need to be working together to create that closed loop to add the business value.
Yep, we do hear about the closed loop piece, right? Once it goes into my ticketing system and it's been solved, you know, how does that last piece happen, right? How do we close that out so that, because they know they're going to continue scanning and they're going to go through this process each week, each day. So how do they make it a workflow issue to solve that? Well, that's the questions that I see. I wanted to take a chance to say, Bob, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that last piece, or?
No, I think just that if we haven't gotten to your question, I think there are some other ones. We will make sure that we get responses out to you after the meeting here, since we are kind of running out of time. And this presentation definitely will be shared with everybody. So we will send out a link where you can get the recording and the slides.
Yep, and we want to say thank you to everybody for showing up today and listening to the presentation. We hope it was helpful and informative. I want to thank Randall Laudermilk from Carson Saint for providing some expertise and information on the vulnerability scanning piece. Bob, I want to thank you as well. We really appreciate you know, the information that you provided. I think it was helpful. And again, thanks everybody for showing up, and have a great day.